At dawn, the rivers of Burkina Faso witnessed something few could believe. A flotilla of boats escorted by armed guards arrived not to patrol or to wage war, but to release 150 tons of live fish into the country's waterways. Tilapia, catfish, carp, shimmering silver bodies plunged into muddy rivers that had known only drought and silence for decades. To some it was madness, a poor nation still wrestling with hunger and instability, and debt spending millions to flood its rivers with fish. What kind of strategy was that? But for those who listened carefully, not to the critics, but to the rhythm of the land, they understood this wasn't waste. It was a signal from Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain turned president, that Burkina Faso would not be fed by others' hands. It would feed itself with rivers as its granaries and fish as its first declaration of independence. Because sometimes revolutions do not begin with gunfire. They begin with ripples in the water. Stay with us. This isn't just about fish. It's about power pride in a nation rising from the shadows. Subscribe so you don't miss how Burkina Faso is rewriting Africa's future. It began with whispers. Whispers of military boats moving upriver. Rumors of tanks, not the kind built for war, but the kind used in fish farming, being lifted onto barges in the dead of night. And then one morning, the people of Burkina Faso awoke to a spectacle: 150 tons of live fish released into the arteries of a nation long thought dry. For a landlocked country like Burkina Faso, rivers have never been central to its economy or identity. The nation depends on rain-fed agriculture, livestock, and imported goods from coastal neighbors like Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. But the land has suffered. Droughts have ravaged crops. Lakes have retreated. Rivers have thinned into trickles, choked by climate change and neglect. And the fish, they had all but vanished. Tilapia, catfish, carp, once staples in the rural diet, became rare luxuries. The average Burkinabe consumed just 1.4 kilograms of fish per year, a mere fraction compared to the West African regional average of 11.1 kilograms. For many families, especially in the countryside, this wasn't just a loss of flavor, it was a loss of vital nutrition. Malnutrition soared. Children with stunted growth filled village clinics. Mothers scoured markets for overpriced frozen fish, wrapped in plastic imported from companies that treated Africa's need as a profit margin. But while previous governments ignored this crisis, Ibrahim Traoré refused. He studied the maps. He listened to the old fishermen. He asked scientists what would happen if the rivers could be revived. Not just cleaned, but repopulated. Could the return of fish shift the fate of a nation? That's when the plan was born. A plan as bold as it was theatrical. The operation began in central Burkina Faso, near the Black Volta Basin. The rivers were surveyed. Native species were carefully selected, not exotic imports, but hardy local breeds adapted to the Sahel climate. Tilapia, known for their resilience and rapid breeding. Carp and catfish, each favoring different sediment types, diversifying the ecosystem. And then the fish arrived, carried in tanks trucked in with military precision. Boats deployed, nets prepared. Communities gathered in disbelief as wave after wave of silver life poured into the water. Children laughed. Elders wept. But behind the symbolism was hard science. The release was timed with the seasonal rains, ensuring the rivers were swollen and oxygen-rich. The species were chosen to avoid ecological shock, no invasive predators, no foreign diseases. The goal wasn't just to feed, but to restore, to rewild what had been lost. And it wasn't just one moment. The government planned successive releases spaced by months across multiple river systems. Engineers and ecologists tracked oxygen levels, algae growth, and predator-prey balance. The initial cost, significant. Critics estimated millions of CFA francs spent. But Traoré's team responded with calculation: what is the price of sovereignty? They argued that this was not an expense, it was an investment. Every fish was a future meal, a future job, a future export. And each kilogram of local fish meant one less kilogram of dependency on frozen imports. The international press, when they noticed, laughed. A fish flood. What next, rice in the skies, they mocked. But in the villages, something was changing. Elders remembered rivers once teeming with life. Now, for the first time in decades, their grandchildren could see the glint of silver in the current. The fishermen returned, and with them hope. Cliffhanger. Was this just a bold performance or the beginning of a food revolution? At first, the radio hosts laughed. Call-in shows lit up with cynics mocking the government's latest stunt. Fish for freedom, they joked. We need roads, not rivers, Western analysts piled on. Economic newsletters scoffed at what they dubbed aquatic populism. Even local political opponents grumbled, you cannot feed the people with fishy dreams. But then something changed. Within weeks of the initial release, fishermen in the Bugariba region began to report catches. At first just a few nets, then dozens, then hundreds. Fresh, shimmering fish returned to the baskets of men who had once abandoned their trade. In one village, a boy brought home a tilapia nearly the length of his arm. His mother, a market vendor, hadn't seen fresh local fish in 10 years. That night, their family ate a meal that hadn't come from a freezer, a border, or a foreign port. It came from their river. Word spread fast. Villagers who had grown weary of politics now gathered at the banks watching for silver ripples. Elders remembered the taste of river catfish. Women organized smoking pits and drying racks. Youth groups began crafting homemade nets and small canoes. The rivers were stirring. And the media, their tone began to shift. Reporters who had once mocked now filmed live from the riverbanks. "We are witnessing something," one journalist confessed. "Something we didn't believe possible." Meanwhile, in the background, Ibrahim Traoré remained composed. He gave no victory speech. "No, I told you so." Instead, he visited schools. There he saw the faces that mattered most: children who for the first time were eating protein-rich lunches provided by local fish farms. The Ministry of Education had quietly partnered with the Ministry of Fisheries to integrate dried fish into school meals, an act that changed more than diets. It changed destiny. One teacher wept as she spoke to journalists. "We used to teach hungry children. Now they can think, learn, grow." And the images? They spread far beyond Burkina Faso. In Ghana, Mali, and Niger, WhatsApp groups shared videos of boats releasing fish. In Ivory Coast and Senegal, diaspora communities in Paris and New York reposted the photos. A leader who gives life back to rivers read one caption. African youth movements took note. For too long, leadership meant gray suits, empty speeches, and donor dependence. But here was a man, young, defiant, and bold, not building skyscrapers, but rebuilding ecosystems. That was the emotional peak. Not when the fish splashed into the water, but when the people slowly, almost hesitantly, began to believe that food didn't have to be foreign. That nutrition wasn't charity. That survival wasn't shame. This wasn't just about fish anymore. It was about dignity. Still, the critics persisted. Unsustainable, they cried. Where's the data? Where's the profit? But the markets answered. In regional centers like Banfora and Dedougou, fish stalls reappeared. Not frozen imports, but fresh local harvests. Prices dropped. Sales surged. And in one remarkable case, a women's cooperative tripled its income in a single quarter by selling smoked catfish to border towns. And in that surge of trade, laughter returned, not mockery, but relief. The kind of laughter that says, "We didn't think it could happen, but now we see." Cliffhanger. Could this ripple of fish stir a wave of political awakening across the continent? Once the rivers began to shimmer with life, the ripple turned into a current, pulling not only fish, but a whole society into motion. In rural provinces long neglected by state infrastructure, something unprecedented unfolded. Markets once dependent on frozen imports were now flush with fresh local fish. Villages once isolated from the national economy found themselves part of a new supply chain, a chain not controlled by foreign investors or coastal middlemen, but by the people themselves. And here is where Ibrahim Traoré's political genius revealed its second layer. He didn't just restock rivers. He rewrote ownership. Under his decree, stretches of waterways were granted to community cooperatives, local councils of farmers, fishers, and elders, who now held legal stewardship over their rivers. With this shift, Burkina Faso turned its lifeblood into a living commons. Traoré called it the river factory model, a factory without walls owned by those who depend on it. It didn't need diesel glass or foreign contracts. It needed nets, hands, and care. Each catch generated more than food. It generated pride and money. Suddenly, riverside entrepreneurs appeared, women building smokehouses from clay and bamboo, men transporting fresh tilapia on modified motorbikes, youth selling salted fish wrapped in banana leaves. Microfinance institutions, once wary of rural lending, began offering small loans for fishing equipment, net repairs, and cold storage units. And then came the farms. Fish farming, once seen as exotic or elite, spread like fire. Traoré's government provided training starter cages and access to hatcheries. With waste from fish ponds enriching the soil, rice paddies and millet fields produced more, completing a symbiotic cycle of food security. Nutrition indicators confirmed the shift in key river provinces. Malnutrition dropped by double digits. School attendance rose. Clinics reported fewer cases of iron and protein deficiency. But it wasn't only health that improved. It was political stability. Traoré knew well the links between hunger and rebellion. In a region often exploited by extremist recruiters who prey on desperation, fish became a line of defense. A full belly earned through honest work was now a barrier stronger than any checkpoint. Even local chiefs, once skeptical of the young president's ambitions, rallied behind the initiative. In traditional ceremonies, rivers were blessed and fishing festivals revived. What was once a forgotten ritual became a new kind of governance rooted not in policy, but in partnership. And as rivers turned, productive towns revived. One mayor described it simply, "Our people used to wait. Wait for rain, wait for aid, wait for imports. Now they fish, they farm, they trade. They don't wait anymore." Of course, no revolution is without resistance. Smugglers who had monopolized frozen fish imports saw profits dwindle. Corrupt officials who controlled food contracts lobbied quietly for the program to slow. Traore responded with what he called nutritional patriotism, a campaign urging citizens to buy local, eat local, invest local. And it worked. Social media brimmed with slogans like "My river, my dinner." From net to plate, fish is freedom. Meanwhile, international observers, once dismissive, began requesting data. They found something remarkable. In just under a year, Burkina Faso reduced fish imports by 25%. A single fish release had ignited a national movement. And communities that had once relied on food aid were exporting dried catfish to regional markets. Cliffhanger: will this fishy economy withstand the threats lurking beneath the surface? As the rivers of Burkina Faso flowed with new life, the world began to take notice, but not all with praise. In the air-conditioned offices of donor agencies in Brussels and Washington, the chatter was hesitant. Some called it a bold experiment. Others, less generous, labeled it naive populism. Western economists questioned the sustainability, the scale, the science. One report even asked what happens when the fish run out. But elsewhere in African capitals, the reaction was far less cynical. From Bamako to Abuja, leaders dispatched quiet envoys to study the program. Togo, Ghana, and Niger sent fisheries experts to observe. The question on their minds was simple. If Burkina Faso can do this without a coastline, what excuse do we have? In meetings of the African Union, Ibrahim Traoré made his message clear. He wasn't looking for applause. He was offering a blueprint. "We do not need aid wrapped in ice," he declared in Addis Ababa. "We need rivers wrapped in life." His speeches, fiery and unapologetic, resonated beyond bureaucratic walls. Youth movements across the continent began circulating excerpts with hashtags like Chachi, Fish Freedom, and Feed Africa. In chat groups from Johannesburg to Dakar, a new kind of pride emerged, a leader investing in biology, not bullets. Yet Traore was careful not to overplay his hand. When asked by a foreign journalist if the United States would support such a model, he replied calmly, "They are welcome to learn from it." It was not a rebuke, but a redirection. He was reframing the narrative from Africa as recipient to Africa as innovator. Even as some U.S. diplomats remained cautious, American think tanks took note. One white paper warned Burkina Faso's aquaculture diplomacy is shaping regional alignment. Another admitted if successful, this could challenge the existing food trade dependency in West Africa. Meanwhile, Traore expanded the message. He proposed a West African aquatic corridor, a multi-nation pact to protect shared rivers, develop hatcheries, and harmonize regulations. Not as a charity case for the West, but as a continental coalition for protein independence. Behind closed doors, some regional leaders rolled their eyes. But others saw an opportunity to break free from grain and fish cartels that had long dictated African diets. And as satellite images showed the green return of riverbanks, the revival of migratory bird patterns, and the slowdown of illegal fishing activity, skepticism turned to silence. Because whatever one thought of the man, the facts were speaking. Cliffhanger: could fish become the new currency of African sovereignty? With rivers once again teeming and markets bustling with the scent of fresh fish, Ibrahim Traoré knew this was no time for celebration. It was time for consolidation. The threats were real. Poaching could undo months of regeneration. Pollution from illegal gold mining lingered like a silent killer. Sabotage, corruption, complacency, any of them could poison the fragile revival he had sparked. So he acted. He trained river guardians, youth and elders, armed not with rifles but with law-mobile phones and community authority. They patrolled riverbanks, monitoring fishing zones, enforcing no-net periods, and educating locals on sustainable practices. Some zones were sanctified as sacred water banned from fishing until stocks matured. And he built more than defense, he built structure. Local cooperatives received microloans to manage hatcheries. Schools signed procurement contracts with community farms. Women's groups were granted ownership rights to manage drying houses and trade routes. Fish became more than food, it became infrastructure. Yet the real stroke of genius was political. Traore began advocating for a Pan-African River Pact, a coalition of countries along the Niger-Volta and Congo basins, to mirror Burkina Faso's gamble. He laid out a simple equation: Africa imports billions in frozen fish each year, while its own rivers are empty. Why beg for what we can breed, he asked at a regional summit. This time there was no laughter. Delegates listened. Even skeptical ministers returned home with quiet conviction. If Burkina Faso, one of the most landlocked and resource-constrained nations, could shift its fate through ecology, what excuse remained for the rest? And as the idea spread, so did the stakes. Traore proposed a shared stock management system, regional hatchery hubs, and a training academy for river-based aquaculture. He invited investors not to control, but to partner with communities owning the assets. For Africa, the choice was now stark. Continue the cycle of dependency, importing frozen fish from distant oceans locked into trade deals favoring others. Or reclaim the rivers, build internal capacity, and rise as a continental bloc with food sovereignty at its core. The model was laid bare. Success would not be gifted, it would be grown. It would require vigilance, unity, and courage. But it was possible. Because the rivers had proven something most couldn't believe, that the smallest, most forgotten spaces of Africa could carry the weight of a continent's dream. Cliffhanger dan sangket by. But what does it really take to turn a fish into a flag? They laughed when it began. A poor landlocked country led by a captain-turned-president dumping fish into muddy waters. They called it absurd, wasteful, a spectacle. But now Burkina Faso stands as a lesson. The rivers run fuller. The markets hum louder. The people eat better. Not because a miracle fell from the sky, but because a nation chose to invest in itself, in its waters, and in its will. What Ibrahim Traoré accomplished was never just about fish. It was about shifting power away from frozen aid packages and towards living ecosystems, away from dependency and towards dignity. He reminded his people and all of us that sovereignty is not won by declarations. It is grown, season by season, catch by catch, and the ripple has become a wave. Other African nations are watching, some already acting. Because Traoré did not merely feed a population, he fed an idea that Africa can rise by the work of its own hands, not by the crumbs of others. And it starts not with grand speeches or global loans. It starts with rivers, with children no longer going to school hungry, with women turning fish into trade, with youth returning to villages not out of desperation, but opportunity, with birds returning to skies that had forgotten them. That is the revolution no one saw coming. So when the history of this era is written, perhaps the chapter on Burkina Faso will not begin with war or famine or politics. Perhaps it will begin with a silver splash, a quiet ripple, and the courage to believe that even in the muddiest waters, something beautiful can grow. If this story stirs your soul, don't just not act. Like, share, and subscribe. Our rivers remember who we are. Let's remind the world. Burkina Faso has shown the path. Burkina Faso has raised the flag. Now the current flows forward. The question is, will Africa follow?